Hello everyone. Before the story start, tell me where are you watching from and what time is it?
The street was a loop I hadn't known existed. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 11 years, walked every block in every direction during those restless, pre-dawn wanderings that had become my substitute for sleep. I knew the grid intimately, the one-way arteries, the sudden dead ends, the alleys that cut through like shortcuts in a fever dream. So when I turned left onto Habersham from the old bakery, I expected to hit Forsyth in 3 blocks. That was the geometry. That was the city I knew. 3 blocks came. 3 blocks went. No Forsyth. Just more of the same, the identical brownstones with their identical wrought iron railings, the same ginkgo trees planted at precise 20-foot intervals, the same cracked pavement that my feet knew by heart. I walked another block, then another. My pace quickened. The streetlights, which had been flickering on in their slow, amber wave ahead of me, now seemed to be lighting a path that coiled back on itself. The gingerbread trim on the 3rd brownstone, a missing scroll I'd noted months ago, appeared again on my left. And again on my right. I stopped. Turned in a slow circle. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that listens. I had been walking for 15 minutes. I should have hit the avenue by now. Instead, I was standing in front of the same brownstone with the missing scroll, the same ginkgo with its lower branch sheared cleanly by a long-ago storm. The bakery was behind me. I could smell the faint ghost of yesterday's bagels. I had not moved. I had traveled in a perfect, invisible loop, and the city had swallowed the distance. I tried again. Walked faster, counting steps, keeping my eyes fixed on the distant promise of Forsyth's wider sky. I passed the brownstone with the missing scroll. Past the ginkgo. Past the dented mailbox. The street curved gently left, then right, curves I didn't recognize, because this street had always been a straight shot. Forsyth did not appear. The brownstone with the missing scroll appeared. I was back. Panic, cold and electric, shot through me. I broke into a run, my footsteps slapping the pavement in a frantic, syncopated rhythm. The brownstones blurred past, identical, endless. My breath sawed in my throat. I ran until my legs burned, until the stitch in my side was a searing claw, until I could no longer tell if I was passing new buildings or the same ones, the same tree, the same crack in the sidewalk shaped like a fishhook. I stopped, bent double, gasping. When I straightened, I was standing at the corner of Habersham and nothing. The cross street was blank. No sign. No traffic light. Just the same brownstone, the same ginkgo, the same missing scroll on the railing. The terror wasn't in the loop. The terror was in the precision. This wasn't a malfunction. This was a room that had been prepared. The city had folded itself into a closed circuit, a Mobius strip of brick and asphalt, and I was the solitary marble rolling endlessly around its track. I sat down on the curb, my back against the familiar railing. The streetlight above me buzzed its drowsy, orange hum. I was trapped, but it was a trap of such meticulous, patient construction that panic felt almost disrespectful. This had been waiting for me. Perhaps for years. Every walk I'd taken, every turn I'd memorized, had been a rehearsal for this final performance. I had learned the script so well that I no longer noticed when the scenery stopped changing. I don't know how long I sat there. Time in a loop is a broken clock. Eventually, I stood up, not with hope, but with a weary resignation. I began to walk again, not fast, not searching. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has accepted the architecture of his confinement. I passed the brownstone. The ginkgo. The dented mailbox. I did not look for Forsyth. I looked at the details I had always overlooked in my hurry to get somewhere else. The missing scroll on the railing was not missing, it was lying in the dead leaves at the base of the stoop, a small, ornate piece of cast iron, rusted and patient. The sheared branch on the ginkgo had healed into a gnarled, arthritic knot that looked almost like a hand. The crack in the sidewalk shaped like a fishhook was deeper than I'd thought, its edges worn smooth by countless footsteps, my footsteps. This was not a random loop. This was my loop. The city had not trapped me, it had revealed the path I had been walking all along. I reached the corner. Not Forsyth. Just the corner. And there, on the rusty pole of a street lamp that had been dark for as long as I could remember, was a small, weathered sign. Not a street name. A single word, hand-painted in faded white letters, the brushwork shaky but legible. Home. I stood at the end, and found the corner where I'd started. And for the first time in 11 years, I knew exactly where I was. The house took 3 years to sell. Not because of the market, but because of the weight. Everyone who walked through the front door felt it, that subtle, gravitational pull, the sense of an atmosphere too dense to breathe. They'd compliment the restored hardwood, the original moldings, the way the morning light filled the kitchen. Then they'd pause in the living room, their gaze drifting to the corner by the fireplace, and their voices would falter. They'd make polite excuses and leave. The realtor stopped returning my calls. I lowered the price. Again. Again. I stopped living there months ago, officially. Moved my clothes, my books, the few pieces of furniture that didn't carry her imprint. But the house itself, I couldn't let it go. It was the last thing. The final, tangible piece of evidence that we had existed, that the life we'd built had been real and not some elaborate, shared dream that was now fading at the edges. I went back on Tuesdays. It became a ritual, a penance. I'd let myself in with the key that still hung on my ring, walk through the silent rooms, and try to feel her absence settle into something manageable. The house held her in its bones, the faint scent of her perfume in the hallway, the specific slant of light she'd loved in the breakfast nook, the creak of the third stair that she always stepped over instinctively. I would stand in these spaces and let the grief wash over me, a tide I'd learned not to fight. This Tuesday was no different. The sky was a flat, November gray. The key turned in the lock with the same reluctant scrape. I stepped into the foyer, and the familiar silence wrapped around me like a cold shroud. I took off my coat, hung it on the hook she'd insisted we install at eye level so guests wouldn't fumble. I walked into the living room. She was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace. Not a ghost. Not a trick of the light. She was there, solid, present. Her hands were folded in her lap, the same way she always held them when she was waiting. Her hair, the same soft gray, was pulled back from her face. Her eyes were on the cold hearth, not seeing it, seeing something else. Something distant. I made a sound, not a word, just the air leaving my lungs in a rush. She didn't look up. I said her name. Nothing. I crossed the room, my legs numb, my heart a frantic, trapped bird. I knelt in front of her, close enough to see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the small scar on her jaw from a childhood accident she'd told me about on our third date. I reached out and touched her hand. It was warm. She blinked, slowly, as if waking from a long, deep sleep. Her gaze drifted to my face, and for a moment, there was no recognition. Just the vast, empty patience of someone who has been waiting so long they've forgotten what they're waiting for. Then her eyes focused. A small, familiar smile, the one that always made her look like she was keeping a gentle secret, touched her lips. "You're late," she said. Her voice was exactly as I remembered. Quiet, a little rough at the edges, like she'd just woken up. My throat closed. I couldn't speak. I held her hand, feeling the pulse beneath her skin, steady and unhurried. She had been here. All this time. The house hadn't been haunted by her absence. It had been occupied by her presence. She had been sitting in this chair, in this room, waiting for me to stop fleeing long enough to find her. I'm sorry, I finally managed, the words a ragged whisper. I didn't know. I thought you were. I know, she said, still smiling that quiet smile. I tried to call you back. But you were already so far away. She squeezed my hand, a gesture of such ordinary, tender affection that my carefully maintained grief cracked open and spilled out in a dry, soundless sob. How long have you been here? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She considered the question, her gaze drifting back to the cold hearth. I don't know. Time is different here. I just waited. I knew you'd come back eventually. You always forget something. Her eyes met mine again, and in them I saw not accusation, not sorrow, but a deep, abiding patience. She had waited. 3 years of Tuesdays, of me walking through this house blind, searching for her ghost while she sat in plain sight, solid and warm, waiting for me to stop looking at the empty spaces and see the occupied one. How? I whispered. She tilted her head, the same thoughtful gesture I'd loved for 42 years. Does it matter? I thought about it. The car accident. The hospital. The terrible, final phone call. The funeral I'd planned with the efficiency of a man in shock. All of it, the grief, the solitude, the slow, painful reconstruction of a life without her, had been built on an assumption. I had assumed she was gone. I had never asked the house. I had never asked her. No, I said. It doesn't matter. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Good. I'm tired of waiting alone. I pulled the other armchair closer to hers. Not to the chair, I didn't need that anymore. I sat beside her, still holding her hand, and we watched the gray light fade from the windows together. She didn't explain. I didn't ask. The house settled around us, its weight shifting from oppressive to protective. The creaks and sighs of the old bones were no longer accusatory. They were, I realized, the sound of a place finally at rest. I don't know how long we sat there. Time is different here. The sun set, the room grew dark, and still we stayed. Her hand remained warm in mine. Her breathing was slow and even, the rhythm of someone who has stopped counting hours. I have stopped running. I have stopped searching empty rooms for traces of her. I have stopped assuming that the worst has already happened, that the story ended on that gray Tuesday 3 years ago. She was already there, as if she'd never moved. And now, so am I. I was lost. Not in the dramatic, heart-pounding sense, but in the quiet, humiliating way that happens when you've walked the same block for 20 years and suddenly realize you don't recognize the intersection. The neighborhood was shifting under my feet, the familiar contours bleeding into something foreign. A laundromat where the old bakery should be. A boutique selling minimalist furniture in the space that once held the corner store where the owner knew my coffee order. I was a stranger in my own life, and the map in my head had become a palimpsest of erasures and ghostly afterimages. I turned down a street I thought was Maple. The sign, when I finally found it bolted to a weathered post, was blank. Not vandalized, the metal wasn't scratched or painted over. It was just empty. A rectangle of municipal green, its surface pristine, waiting for letters that had never been stamped. I stood beneath it, staring up, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The street stretched out behind me, lined with houses I couldn't place. They looked like houses from my childhood, from vacations, from dreams, generic, archetypal, familiar in the way a remembered scent is familiar. I stepped closer to the sign. The blank metal caught the weak afternoon light, and in its polished surface I saw my own face. Not a reflection, the angle was wrong for that. It was an image, clear and distinct, floating on the featureless green. My eyes, my nose, the worried furrow between my brows. It was me, but me as I was 20 years ago, before the job and the marriage and the slow accretion of compromises that had sanded my edges smooth. The same me, but younger, sharper, still full of a conviction I'd long since misplaced. I reached up to touch the sign. My fingertip met cold, smooth metal. The image rippled, then settled. It wasn't a reflection. It was a portrait. And it was the only name this street had ever needed. I walked on, my feet moving of their own accord. The next corner bore the same sign, blank, waiting, my younger face gazing out from its surface with that long-lost certainty. The street beyond it was wider, lined with oaks I remembered from a different city, a different life. I turned. The sign at the next intersection held my face from 10 years ago, softer at the jaw, the furrow beginning to etch itself between my brows. I looked tired, but hopeful. The street behind me was already dissolving into gray static. I understand now. I have been walking these streets all my life, and they have never had names. The city's cartography is not a grid of coordinates and titles. It is a map of the selves I have abandoned. Each intersection is a decision I made or failed to make, each block a stretch of time I inhabited before moving on. The signs do not tell me where I am. They tell me who I was when I was there. And my reflection, floating on those blank, patient surfaces, is the only landmark I have ever truly had. I keep walking. The street ahead is unfamiliar, but the sign at its corner is waiting. The face it holds is older, wearier, the furrow now a permanent groove. It is the face I wore this morning, before I stepped out my door and into this labyrinth of lost selves. I pause beneath it, looking up at the man I was just hours ago. He looks back at me with a question I am not yet ready to answer. Somewhere ahead, on a street that bears no name and no reflection, there is a sign waiting with my future face. I am not ready to meet him yet. So I stand here, at this nameless corner, caught between the man I was this morning and the man I will become, the cold metal of the sign pressing against my fingertips, the only compass I have left. The decision to turn back was not a dramatic revelation. It was a quiet, cumulative exhaustion, the kind that settles into bone after years of walking in the wrong direction. I had been following this road, this life, for so long that I'd forgotten I was choosing it. Each step was automatic, a muscle memory of forward momentum. But somewhere between the last disappointing phone call and the latest sleepless dawn, I remembered that I had a choice. I could stop. I could turn around. I could go back to the place where the road had felt wide and full of possibility, before it narrowed to this claustrophobic corridor of obligation and regret. I planted my feet on the cracked asphalt. The road behind me stretched into a gray, featureless haze, the same way it always had. I took a breath, gathered the weight of my intention, and pivoted on my heel. My body faced the opposite direction. My feet were pointed back the way I'd come. I took a step. The road did not cooperate. It didn't physically resist, there was no wall, no sudden chasm. But the landscape itself seemed to rearrange. The gray haze didn't recede, it simply relocated. The patch of cracked asphalt I just occupied slid smoothly to my left, becoming the path ahead. The row of identical poplars that had lined the road behind me were now lining the road in front of me. I was facing forward again, my attempted reversal absorbed and neutralized by the geometry of the place. I tried again, this time with deliberate focus. I turned. I stepped. The road flexed, shifted, and presented me with the same unspooling ribbon of gray leading to the same indistinct horizon. It was like trying to swim against a current that existed only in the medium itself. The road was not a static thing I could traverse at will. It was a directed flow, and I was a leaf on its surface. Panic, cold and crystalline, formed in my chest. I stopped trying to turn. I stood still, breathing in the thin, neutral air, and considered my situation with the detached clarity of a man examining a trap he'd walked into with his eyes wide open. The road had no memory. That was the horror of it. It didn't recognize that I had been here before, that I had already walked this stretch, that the poplar with the split trunk was the third such tree I'd passed and not the first. Every step forward was a new step, untainted by history, unburdened by the possibility of return. The past was not behind me. It was simply elsewhere. Unreachable. The road only offered forward because forward was the only direction it understood. I began to walk again, not because I wanted to, but because standing still felt like a more profound surrender. The poplars passed in their stately, identical procession. The gray sky remained gray. My footsteps were the only sound, a lonely percussion against the indifferent asphalt. After what might have been hours or days, I noticed a change. The road, which had been featureless and uniform, began to accumulate traces. A footprint here, not mine, the tread pattern unfamiliar. A discarded wrapper, its label faded to illegibility. A single, faded ribbon tied to a low-hanging branch, its color bleached to the palest pink. I was not the first to walk this way. Others had been here, ahead of me, leaving these small, cryptic signatures of their passage. And none of them, I realized with a cold certainty, had turned back either. The road began to narrow. The poplars gave way to a dense, featureless hedge that pressed close on either side, its leaves a uniform, waxy green that reflected no light. The asphalt beneath my feet became rougher, patched and repatched with dark tar that looked like scars. I walked faster, not from hope of destination, but from a growing need to outrun the accumulating weight of the road itself. A figure appeared ahead, silhouetted against the perpetual gray. I slowed, my heart hammering. It was a man, standing still in the center of the road, facing away from me. His posture was familiar, the slight slump of the shoulders, the way his weight rested on his left foot. I approached cautiously, my footsteps deliberately loud to announce my presence. He didn't turn. I circled around him, keeping a careful distance, and looked at his face. It was mine. Older, wearier, the furrow between his brows now a permanent canyon. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, unfocused, as if he were looking through the gray haze to something I couldn't yet see. He didn't acknowledge me. He didn't move. He was a statue of my future self, placed here as a signpost I couldn't read. I reached out to touch his shoulder. My hand passed through empty air. He was not here. He had never been here. He was a projection, a warning, a promise. The road only offered forward, and forward was this, an older, stiller version of myself, frozen in the act of waiting for something that would never arrive. I left him there, standing sentinel over a stretch of road I would someday occupy. I walked on, the hedge pressing closer, the asphalt growing rougher, the footprints and discarded wrappers accumulating in greater density. I was not alone on this road. I was merely late to the procession. Others had walked here before me, and others would walk here after, all of us facing forward, all of us unable to turn back, all of us leaving small, cryptic traces of our passage for the next weary traveler to find. The road only offers forward. It has never offered anything else. And I, who spent a lifetime believing I was choosing my direction, have finally understood that the choice was never mine to make. I was placed on this road at birth, facing this direction, and every step I've taken since has been a negotiation with the illusion of free will. Forward is not a direction. It is a condition. It is the state of being in motion without the possibility of return. And the horizon, that gray, indistinct promise, is not a destination. It is the point at which forward finally, mercifully, ceases to exist. I walk. The road offers forward. I accept. This is the only prayer I have left. The insomnia had become a landscape, a terrain I navigated nightly with the same careful, exhausted footsteps. I knew the exact number of paces from my bedroom door to the kitchen sink, from the sink to the window overlooking the empty street. 14. 11. 23. The apartment was a small kingdom, and I was its solitary, sleepless cartographer, mapping the same territories again and again in the gray hours between midnight and dawn. On the 17th night of this particular siege, I became aware that I was being counted. Not by a device. Not by my own obsessive tally. By her. She sat in the armchair by the window, the one that faced the street and never faced me. Her name was Lena, and she had been dead for 11 months. I knew this the way I knew the distance from the sink to the window, as a fact, measurable and indifferent. Yet here she was, her silhouette soft against the sodium glow of the street lamp, her hands folded in her lap, her lips moving in a rhythm I could not hear but could feel. It was a pulse, a cadence, a breath drawn and released in precise, deliberate intervals. I stopped walking. My foot hovered over the cold hardwood, and her breath paused with it. Not ceased, paused. Held in suspension, waiting. I lowered my foot. She exhaled, a soft, almost inaudible sigh that carried the weight of completion. She was counting my steps. Not the number, but the spaces between them. The rests. The hesitations. The moments when I stood still, paralyzed by the simple, impossible act of deciding where to go next. I said her name. She did not turn. Her lips continued their silent arithmetic. I took a step toward her, and her breath caught, not a gasp, but a sharp, anticipatory intake, as if my movement was a note she had been waiting to harmonize with. I took another step. She released the breath in a slow, steady stream, timed precisely to the arc of my foot's descent. She was not counting steps. She was breathing them. Each movement I made was a syllable in a language she was speaking with her lungs and her stillness. I stopped in front of the armchair. Her face was the same as I remembered, pale, composed, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes etched deeper by the lamplight. Her gaze was fixed on the window, on the street where I had watched her walk away 1,000 times in my memory. But her attention was on me, on the rhythm of my body in space. Her lips parted, and she spoke. 14, she said, her voice a whisper of dry leaves. From the bed to the door. You always pause on the threshold. 3 beats. 2.5, when you're anxious. My throat closed. I had never told her this. I had never told anyone. 11 to the sink, she continued, her eyes still on the window. You count the cracks in the linoleum. 7 of them. You step over the 3rd one. Always. It's a habit you don't know you have. I looked down at the floor. The cracks were there, faint shadows in the worn pattern. I had never noticed that I avoided the 3rd one. But my body knew. My body had been telling her the story of my sleepless nights in a language I didn't know I was speaking. 23 to the window, she said. You stand there for 17 breaths. Sometimes 19. Then you turn and begin again. How do you know this? My voice was a rasp, a sound I barely recognized. She did not answer immediately. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, measured rhythm, not her own, I realized, but mine. She was breathing with me, synchronizing her lungs to the subtle, unconscious cadence of my body at rest. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, threaded with something that might have been sorrow or might have been exhaustion. I've been counting your steps since the day I left, she said. It was the only way I could stay with you. Your breath, your pauses, the way you hesitate before a door. It's a language. You speak it constantly. I just listen. I sank onto the arm of the sofa, my legs unable to support the weight of her words. I thought you were gone. I am, she said. But you carry me in the rhythm of your walking. The spaces between your footsteps are mine. The pauses are where I live now. Her hand, translucent in the lamplight, lifted from her lap and hovered in the air between us. It did not reach for me. It simply waited. A pause. A rest. A breath held in anticipation of a step I had not yet taken. I understood then. She was not a ghost haunting my apartment. She was a pattern in my own motion, a resonance in the pauses, a language I had been speaking to the empty rooms for 11 months without knowing I was being answered. She counted my steps because my steps were the only words she had left. And she breathed in the spaces between them because that was where she could still exist. I took her hand. It was cool, weightless, but solid beneath my fingers. Her breath caught, that same sharp, anticipatory intake, and then released in a long, steady sigh that seemed to carry the accumulated silence of 11 months. She turned her face from the window and looked at me. Her eyes, gray and depthless, held a reflection of the sleepless man I had become, framed in the geometry of a room we had both memorized in different ways. 17, she whispered. From the chair to the door. You always take 17 steps. You never vary. I had never counted. But I knew, with the certainty of a body that remembers what the mind forgets, that she was right. 17. Always 17. I stood, still holding her hand. Her breath synchronized with my movement, a soft intake as I rose, a held pause as I steadied myself, a slow release as I took the first step toward the door. She rose with me, not standing, but flowing, her presence an extension of my own motion, a counterpoint to my rhythm. We walked together to the door. 17 steps. Her breath marked each one, a soft punctuation in the silent air. At the threshold, I paused, 3 beats, as she had said, and her breath paused with me. In that shared suspension, the space between heartbeats, she was more present than she had been in any of the dreams or memories I had clung to during the long months of her absence. I opened the door. The hallway beyond was dark, but the darkness was not empty. It was filled with the same patient, listening silence that had accompanied my solitary pacing for 11 months. I took a step forward, into the unknown geography of the night, and her breath released in a long, steady stream, a word in a language I was only beginning to understand. She counted my steps. In a language of breath and pause. And I, who had spent a lifetime walking away from everything I loved, was finally learning to walk with someone who had never left. It started with a window. Not a specific window, but the relationship between them. I was standing at the intersection of 5th and Grand, waiting for the light to change, when I noticed that the facades of the buildings on either side of the street were no longer parallel. They tilted toward each other, almost imperceptibly, their upper stories leaning in like old friends sharing a secret. I blinked, attributing it to the glare of the low autumn sun. When I looked again, the angle had increased. The tops of the buildings were closer together than their bases. I crossed the street quickly, my eyes fixed on the pavement. But the sensation persisted. The street no longer felt like a straight line, it was a gentle curve, a subtle arc that bent around me as I moved. The buildings on my left and right were no longer opposing walls of a canyon. They were the ribs of a vast, slowly closing fist, and I was the object held in its palm. I stopped walking. The curve continued, unhurried, inevitable. The gap between the rooftops narrowed by inches. A sliver of sky, visible between the cornices, diminished to a thread. I could feel the pressure now, not a physical force, but a presence, a gathering of intent. The city was not collapsing. It was contracting. Deliberately, gently, with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time for this moment. I began to run. Not toward anything, there was no toward anymore, only the enclosing curve. I ran down streets that bent back on themselves, past storefronts whose windows reflected not the opposite buildings but the insides of my own skull. The curve tightened. The thread of sky vanished. The light that remained was not from above but from within, a soft, diffused glow that seemed to emanate from the bricks themselves. I stopped running. There was nowhere to run to. The street was no longer a street. It was a chamber, curved and seamless, its walls formed from the united facades of 1,000 buildings. The doors and windows were still there, but they no longer opened outward. They opened onto each other, onto the interior space that had once been the open air. I was inside the city. Not inside a building, but inside the city itself, the way a seed is inside a fruit. I pressed my palm against the nearest wall. It was warm, and beneath the surface, I felt a slow, steady pulse. The city was alive. Not metaphorically. Not in the way poets speak of living cities. It was alive in the most literal sense, a vast, composite organism of stone and steel and glass, and I was a mote in its bloodstream, caught in the systole of its slow, patient breath. The curve continued. The walls, which had been inches from my shoulders, now brushed against my coat. I turned sideways, then pressed my back against one surface and my palms against the other. The curve was a hand, and the hand was closing. I closed my eyes and waited for the pressure to become unbearable, for the slow crush of stone against stone with me in between. It stopped. I opened my eyes. The walls were still there, warm and close, but they were no longer moving. A seam of light appeared before me, vertical and thin, widening into a doorway. Beyond it was not another street, not another chamber. It was a room. Small, familiar. The armchair by the window. The bookshelf with the uneven shelf. The photograph on the mantel, its frame slightly crooked. My living room. I stepped through the doorway, and the walls behind me sealed without a sound. The room was exactly as I had left it that morning, the cup of cold coffee on the side table, the blanket draped over the arm of the sofa. I stood in the center of my own life, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of my existence, and for the first time in years, I did not feel the urge to flee. The city had not trapped me. It had returned me. The long curve of its closing hand had been a gesture of retrieval, not imprisonment. All those years of walking its streets, learning its turns, memorizing the rhythm of its lights and the texture of its silence, it had been learning me in return. It had been mapping my routes, charting my hesitations, noting the buildings I paused beneath and the corners I turned with reluctance. And when it had finally understood the shape of my loneliness, it had folded itself around me and carried me home. I sit now in my armchair, the one that faces the window. The street outside is quiet, the buildings standing at their proper, respectful distances. But I know, with a certainty that transcends logic, that they are not indifferent. They are patient. They are waiting. The hand has opened, but it has not withdrawn. It rests, curved and gentle, around the perimeter of my life, ready to close again when I wander too far. The buildings curve gently, like the inside of a closing hand. And I am learning, slowly, to stop trying to escape the palm. The argument had been about nothing, which made it about everything. I don't remember the words now, only the aftermath, my wife's retreating footsteps, the slam of the bedroom door, and the silence that followed, dense, suffocating, a third presence in the room. I stood in the hallway, my hand still raised from a gesture that had nowhere to go, and I felt the anger curdle into something heavier. Not sadness. Not regret. Just a thick, immovable weight that settled in my chest and refused to move. I needed to leave a mark. Something physical. Something that would outlast this moment, that would prove I had been here, that this house had witnessed this particular iteration of my failure. I balled my hand into a fist and, with a force that surprised me, drove it into the wall beside the hallway mirror. The impact was solid, satisfying. The drywall crunched. My knuckles split. Blood welled from the abrasions, thin and bright, and I smeared it across the dented surface, a crude, impulsive signature. There. I had made my mark. It was ugly and violent and real. I stood there, breathing hard, waiting for the act to make me feel something other than this leaden emptiness. It didn't. I cleaned my hand in the bathroom sink, watching the water swirl pink. The bedroom door remained closed. I didn't knock. I went to the living room and sat in the dark until the sky outside shifted from black to gray. Morning came, as mornings do, with its quiet insistence on continuance. My wife and I moved around each other in a careful, wordless choreography. She left for work without looking at me. I stayed at the kitchen table, my bandaged hand wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, staring at the wall in the hallway where my mark should have been. It wasn't there. I walked to the spot, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drum. The wall was smooth, unblemished. No dent. No blood. No evidence that I had ever raised my hand against it. I pressed my palm against the surface, cool, intact, as if it had never been broken. I knelt, searching for any trace, any imperfection. Nothing. A rational explanation, I told myself. I had misremembered. The mark was on a different wall. I had dreamed the whole thing. The grief and exhaustion had conjured a memory that never occurred. I forced myself to believe this, even as my bandaged knuckles throbbed with a very real ache. I went back to work. I came home. I didn't mention it. The days accumulated, a stack of identical gray slabs, and I almost convinced myself that the incident had been a hallucination. Then I found the basement door. It was in the back of the linen closet, behind boxes of Christmas decorations we hadn't touched in years. I had lived in this house for over a decade and never noticed it. A small, narrow door, painted the same off-white as the walls, its handle a simple brass knob worn smooth by countless turns. I don't know what compelled me to open it. A restlessness, perhaps. A need to find something I had lost. The stairs descended into a darkness that was not complete, but ambient, a soft, gray gloom that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I went down, one cautious step at a time, my hand sliding along a railing that was cold and faintly sticky with age. The basement was unfinished, its floor packed earth, its walls raw fieldstone. A single bulb hung from a frayed cord, unlit. The light came from elsewhere. I saw the marks immediately. They covered the wall opposite the stairs, a dense palimpsest of damage and repair. Dents in the stone, some shallow, some deep enough to have fractured the surface. Dark stains, rust brown and ancient. Handprints, smeared and overlapping, pressed into the mortar as if the wall itself had been kneaded like clay. And there, at eye level, unmistakable, my mark. The dent was the same shape, the same depth. The bloodstain, now faded to a pale sepia, traced the exact pattern my knuckles had left on that night. I was already beginning to doubt. It was older than it should have been. Not weeks old. Years. Decades. The edges of the impact were worn smooth by time, the blood oxidized to the color of dead leaves. I reached out and placed my hand over the print. It fit perfectly, my fingers aligning with the faded ghost of my own fingers, my palm settling into the slight depression my own violence had carved. The stone was cold, but beneath it, I felt a vibration, slow, deep, patient. The house was breathing. It had been breathing all along, waiting for me to descend these stairs, to find the archive of all my failures. I looked at the other marks. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Each one unique, yet each one somehow familiar. A deep gouge near the floor, shaped like the heel of a shoe. A cluster of smaller dents, like the impact of flung objects. A long, jagged scar, perhaps from a tool, perhaps from something sharper. And everywhere, the handprints. Small ones, large ones, some high on the wall where only a child could reach. They overlapped, layered, a sedimentary record of rage and grief and desperation. This was not my house. This was the house. The one I had always lived in, the one I had always fled, the one that collected every moment of rupture and preserved it in stone. The mark I had made last week was here because I had made it here before, in other lives, other years, other versions of this same argument, this same helpless fury. I had been descending these stairs for decades, leaving the same mark on the same wall, and the house had been patiently saving them all. I climbed back up, my legs heavy, my mind a slow, churning fog. The basement door closed behind me with a soft click. The linen closet was just a linen closet. The hallway wall was smooth and white. But I know now. I have always known. The house remembers every time I have failed to be the man I wanted to be. It has kept a record, not of my successes or my kindnesses or my quiet, ordinary decencies, but of my violence, the moments when the weight inside me became too heavy and I lashed out at the nearest surface. The wall has absorbed it all. It has forgiven me, in its patient, mineral way. It has healed itself, smoothed over the damage, waited for me to descend again and add my handprint to the archive. I left a mark on the wall. I found it already there, dried and faded. And I understood that I am not the first man to stand in this basement, staring at his own violence fossilized in stone. I am not the first, and I will not be the last. The house is patient. The wall waits. And I, who thought my rage was singular and unprecedented, am merely the latest in a long, unbroken line of broken men, leaving the same marks on the same stones, hoping that this time, the record will be different. It never is. But still, we descend. Still, we make our marks. Still, the house breathes, and waits, and remembers. The stain on the hallway wall was older than our marriage. It was there when we bought the house, a shadow the color of weak tea just above the baseboard, roughly the size and shape of an open hand. The previous owners had painted over it twice. We found the layers when we stripped the wallpaper, a palimpsest of ivory and eggshell concealing something they clearly wanted to forget. But stains remember. They seep through primer and patience, resurfacing in certain lights, at certain hours, a ghost insisting on its geography. I had learned to ignore it. It was just a feature of the house, like the cracked corner of the kitchen ceiling or the door that stuck in August. My wife, Ilara, noticed it more than I did. Sometimes I'd catch her standing in the hallway, her gaze fixed on that faint, hand-shaped shadow, her expression unreadable. I never asked. Some histories are better left in their layers of paint. Then came the Tuesday evening when everything shifted. Not dramatically, there was no thunderclap, no revelation. We were simply passing each other in the hallway, she coming from the kitchen, I from the study, our trajectories intersecting at that precise spot. She paused, as she often did, her eyes on the stain. I paused with her, the weight of 10 years of unasked questions suddenly pressing on my chest. "What is it?" I said. "What do you see?" She didn't answer immediately. Her hand rose, slow and tentative, and hovered over the faded mark. Her fingers, pale and slender, traced its outline in the air. Then, with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent, she pressed her palm flat against the wall, covering the stain completely. The paint grew fresh again. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a slow, chemical reaction. It was instantaneous and absolute. Where her hand touched, the faded ivory deepened to a rich, wet cream. The edges of the stain dissolved, absorbed into the new, vibrant surface. The shadow lifted. The wall was pristine, immaculate, as if it had never borne any mark at all. She withdrew her hand. Her palm was clean, unmarked. The wall was new. I stared, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my voice. Ilara looked at her hand, then at the wall, then at me. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a depth I had never seen before, not surprise, not confusion. Recognition. "It was my mother's," she said quietly. "The stain. She lived in this house, before us. Before she married. She told me once that she put her hand through the wall. An argument with her father. She was 17. I had never known this. I had never known her mother had lived in this house. I had never known there was a history here deeper than our own accumulation of days. She tried to paint over it," Ilara continued, her voice a thread. "But it always came back. She said the house remembered. It kept the shape of her anger, the weight of it. She carried that mark for 60 years. Every time she visited, she'd touch it. She said it was the only proof that she had ever been young enough to break things. I looked at the wall, now smooth and unblemished. "And you can erase it?" "No," she said. "Not erase. I can only complete it. The anger isn't here anymore. It's been waiting for someone to release it." She touched the wall again, lightly, her fingers tracing the spot where her mother's hand had once struck. "She told me, before she died. She said the stain would stay until someone touched it with forgiveness. Not for her father. For herself." I had no words. I stood in the hallway, beside this woman I had loved for a decade, and watched her heal a wound she had inherited before she was born. The fresh paint gleamed in the late afternoon light, clean and innocent. The ghost had finally accepted its release. We stood there for a long time, not speaking. The house settled around us, its familiar creaks and sighs seeming softer, less burdened. The stain was gone. But the handprint remained, not on the wall, but in the shape of Alara's fingers pressed against the fresh paint, in the weight of her palm, in the forgiveness she had carried here without knowing it was hers to give. She turned to me, and for the first time in months, her smile reached her eyes. "You never asked," she said. "About the stain. You never asked why I always stopped here." "I didn't want to intrude," I said. "It seemed like a private grief." "It was," she said. "But it was also yours. This house, this hallway, this mark, it's been waiting for both of us." She took my hand, lifted it, and pressed my palm against the fresh paint beside hers. "You leave your own marks," she said. "Everyone does. But they don't have to stay forever." The paint was cool and smooth beneath my fingers. I pressed harder, leaving no impression. The wall was whole. The history was complete. And in that small, perfect act of restoration, I understood that some stains are not meant to be painted over. They are meant to be touched, finally, by the hand that carries the forgiveness they have been waiting for, through decades, through generations, through all the layers of silence and forgetting. She touched the same spot. And the paint grew fresh again. The wall remembers nothing now but the warmth of her palm. It happened at the moment I finally stopped searching. Not in resignation, but in a quiet, exhausted acceptance. I had been walking for what felt like years, through the canyon streets, across the endless plazas, along the river that curved back on itself no matter how far I followed it. The city had unfolded before me like a labyrinth without a center, and I had traversed it with the dogged faith of a man who believes every path leads somewhere. But somewhere had become a word without meaning. Every destination I reached was just another point of departure. I was standing on the observation deck of the old tower, the one they'd closed to the public years ago but which I had found a way into through a rusted fire escape. The city sprawled beneath me, a circuit board of light and shadow, its streets radiating outward in concentric rings that seemed to promise infinite expansion. I had believed in that promise once. I had believed that if I walked far enough, would eventually arrive at the edge, the place where the city surrendered to something else, fields, forest, ocean, sky. But the city had taught me otherwise. It had shown me, through years of patient instruction, that its edges were not boundaries but thresholds, each one opening onto another layer of itself. I leaned against the railing and watched the sun bleed into the western quadrant. The horizon was a clean, sharp line, the definitive boundary between earth and sky. I had spent my whole life oriented toward it, measuring my progress by its fixed and distant certainty. It was the one thing the city could not incorporate, the one limit it could not dissolve. The horizon was always there, always beyond, always the same. And then it rolled up. Not like a curtain rising. Like a map being returned to its pouch. The clean line of the horizon softened, then curled at its edges, then began to lift from the base of the sky as if drawn upward by an invisible hand. The sky did not collapse, it folded. The band of deepening blue at the edge of the world pleated into itself, compressing westward into a tight, glowing scroll. The distant hills, which had been a faint smudge against the light, tilted and slid, their contours flattening into inked lines on a shrinking surface. The river, which had traced its silver thread to the unseen sea, shortened, pooled, and was absorbed into the gathering roll. I watched, paralyzed not by fear but by a strange, dawning recognition. This was not destruction. This was conclusion. The horizon had been a promise, an invitation to infinite journey. But I had journeyed enough. I had followed every street, turned every corner, climbed every stair. I had seen the city in its dawns and its dusks, its furious noons and its sleepless midnights. I had walked its circumference and its interior, its heights and its depths. There was nothing left to discover. The map of my wanderings was complete. The rolled horizon continued its ascent, a scroll of fading light rising into the darkening dome. It passed the level of the tallest towers, then the altitude of the highest clouds, then the point where the first stars should have appeared. The sky above it remained, not empty, but expectant, a blank surface waiting for new inscription. The scroll itself grew smaller as it rose, its details compressing into a single, glowing line, then a point, then nothing. It winked out like the last ember of a dying fire. The city was silent. Not the tense, listening silence of before, but the peaceful stillness of a room after the last guest has departed. The streets still held their geometry, the buildings their mass. But the sense of endlessness, of perpetual horizon-bound motion, had evaporated. The city was no longer a labyrinth. It was a dwelling. I descended from the tower. My footsteps were the only sound, but they did not echo. The streets knew me now, they did not need to announce my passage. I walked without destination, but without anxiety. Every turn was familiar, every facade a remembered face. I passed the bakery where I had bought my first loaf, the library where I had spent countless afternoons, the park bench where I had once wept without knowing why. The city held all my histories, not as burdens but as textures, the accumulated sediment of a life lived in one place. I arrived at my door. It was not the door I had left that morning, or that year, or that lifetime ago. It was a different door, on a different street, in a different neighborhood. But I recognized it immediately. It was the door I had always been walking toward, through all the circuits and detours and false summits. The horizon had rolled up, and here, at the center of the folded map, was the home I had never stopped seeking. I opened the door. The rooms inside were warm and still, lit by the soft, sourceless glow of a day that did not need to end. A chair faced the window. A book lay open on the table. A cup of tea, still steaming, waited beside it. I sat down. I picked up the book. I drank the tea. The city breathed around me, its streets and towers and bridges all oriented now not toward an infinite horizon but toward this single, quiet room. The map had been returned to its pouch. The journey was complete. And I was, at last, exactly where I needed to be. The resistance had become so familiar I had forgotten it was there. A constant, low-grade tension in my shoulders, a subtle clench in my jaw, a perpetual lean forward into the next moment, the next block, the next obligation. I walked the city like a man perpetually late, even when I had nowhere to be. The pavement pushed back against my heels. The doors required extra force. The wind seemed always against me, a gentle but relentless pressure demanding I keep moving, keep striving, keep reaching for a destination I could never quite articulate. I don't know when I first became aware of it. Perhaps it was the morning I stood at the crosswalk and felt no urgency to cross. The light cycled from red to green to red again, and I simply stood, watching the empty intersection, my breath slow and even. The familiar tension in my chest began to loosen, not in a dramatic release but in a gradual, almost imperceptible unwinding. I was not waiting for anything. I was simply present. I took a step. Not toward anything. Just a step. The pavement yielded slightly under my foot, a subtle give I had never noticed before. I took another step. The wind, which had been a constant adversary, shifted to my back, a gentle nudge rather than a resistance. I walked without intention, without destination, without the internal argument that had accompanied every movement for as long as I could remember. The street released a long, soft sigh. It was not a sound I heard with my ears. It was a vibration I felt through the soles of my shoes, a relaxation of tension in the asphalt itself. The cracks in the pavement, which had always seemed like wounds, now appeared as natural creases, the comfortable wrinkles of a well-worn path. The buildings on either side, which had loomed with silent judgment, settled slightly into their foundations, their facades softening from stern to serene. The streetlights dimmed a fraction, not in failure but in rest, their perpetual vigilance finally permitted a moment of repose. I understood then. The city had been resisting me because I had been resisting it. Every step I took was a declaration of war against the present moment, a refusal to be where I was, a constant striving for somewhere else, something else, someone else. I walked the streets as if I could outrun my own life, and the city, in its patient, sentient way, had pushed back. It had made itself difficult, obstructive, hostile. Not out of malice, but out of a desperate attempt to slow me down, to make me feel the weight of my own flight. I stopped resisting. I stopped trying to be elsewhere. I stood in the middle of the sidewalk, on a block I had traversed 1,000 times, and I allowed myself to be fully, completely, irrevocably here. The city exhaled. The sigh traveled down the street like a ripple across still water. I felt it pass beneath me, through the subway grates and manhole covers, along the buried conduits and forgotten foundations. It loosened the grip of traffic lights on their cycles, allowed the neon signs to flicker into a softer, less urgent rhythm. It released the tension in the power lines overhead, their humming dropping from a sharp, insistent whine to a low, contented drone. The city was not just relaxing. It was forgiving me. I walked on, but differently now. My footsteps were no longer a percussion of urgency but a gentle conversation between soul and stone. The pavement responded with a yielding give, a subtle spring that made each step feel supported rather than opposed. The doors I passed through swung open with a welcoming ease, their hinges silent. The wind, when it came, was not an adversary but a companion, matching my pace, then wandering off to attend to other matters. I reached the corner where I had spent countless hours waiting for lights that never seemed to change in my favor. The walk signal was white, steady, patient. I did not cross immediately. I stood at the edge of the curb and watched the traffic flow in its orderly, indifferent streams. A woman passed me, her footsteps rapid and sharp, her shoulders hunched against some invisible pressure. I recognized the tension in her frame. I had carried it myself, for years. She did not look at me. She did not feel the sigh. She was still at war with the city, and the city, in its patient way, was still resisting her. I crossed the street when I was ready, not when the signal commanded. The pavement on the other side received me with the same gentle give. I continued my walk, no longer fleeing, no longer seeking. The city breathed around me, its rhythm now synchronized with my own slow, steady pulse. I arrived at my door. It was a door I had opened and closed thousands of times, always with a slight resistance, a stubborn catch that required an extra push. Today, it swung open at the lightest touch, its hinges silent, its threshold level. I stepped inside, and the house exhaled with me, a long, soft sigh that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves, from the settled dust and the still air and the patient, waiting silence of a place that had always been home. I sat in my chair. I did not turn on the lamp. The gray light of the approaching evening filled the room with a soft, even glow. The city continued its slow exhalation around me, a gentle, rhythmic breath that I could feel in the walls, in the floor, in the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of traffic. I was no longer separate from it, no longer at war with it. I was a part of its respiration, a single cell in its vast, slow body. The street released a long, soft sigh. And I, who had spent a lifetime holding my breath, finally learned to breathe with it. I had spent 43 years looking for the door. Not consciously, not in the way one searches for lost keys or a misplaced letter. But in the deeper architecture of my life, in the accumulated weight of all the rooms I had entered and exited, all the thresholds I had crossed and closed behind me, I had been perpetually, quietly oriented toward the next door. The one that would open onto something else. Something better. Something that would finally explain why I had spent my whole life walking through rooms that never quite felt like mine. The apartment had 3 doors. The front door, which opened onto the hallway and, beyond it, the street. The bedroom door, which I sometimes closed and sometimes left ajar, depending on the quality of my sleep. The closet door, which I kept shut because what was behind it was not lost but merely stored. I had walked through these doors thousands of times, their handles worn to a familiar patina, their threshold slightly hollowed by the passage of my feet. I knew their weight, their resistance, the particular sound of their closing. They were mine. They were enough. Or so I told myself. She arrived on a Tuesday, in the gray hour between afternoon and evening. I don't know how she entered. I don't know if she used a door or simply materialized in the accumulated stillness of my solitary life. She was simply there, sitting in the armchair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the street below. I did not ask her name. I did not ask how she had come. Her presence was not an intrusion but a completion, as if she had always been there and I had only just acquired the capacity to perceive her. We did not speak much. She was not a talker. She sat, and I sat, and the silence between us was not empty but full, a vessel holding all the words we did not need to say. I made tea. She accepted it with a small nod. I returned to my chair. The afternoon deepened into evening. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, in their slow, amber procession. I don't know how long this continued. Days, weeks, months. Time in that apartment had become a different substance, viscous and patient. I stopped counting. I stopped measuring my life in the passage of hours and began to measure it in the quality of light, the angle of shadows, the rhythm of her breath. Then, one evening, she stood. It was such a simple act, and yet it carried the weight of a decision I had been avoiding for decades. She rose from the armchair with a slow, deliberate grace, her movements unhurried but absolute. She crossed the room and stood before me, her gray eyes holding mine with an expression I could not read. Not sorrow. Not joy. Something older. Something final. You have been looking in the wrong direction, she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried no gentleness. It was the voice of a cartographer correcting a persistent error. I did not understand. I had never been looking. I had simply been living, moving from room to room, door to door, accumulating the small, ordinary evidence of a life. She stepped aside. The wall behind her was the same wall that had always been there. The same off-white paint, the same faint scuff marks from decades of furniture being moved and replaced. The same framed print I had bought at a museum gift shop and never really looked at. The same everything. And yet, where the wall had been solid and continuous, there was now a door. It was not new. It had not materialized in the moment she moved. It had always been there, its edges seamlessly integrated into the wall's surface, its handle the same soft brass as the others. I had walked past it 10,000 times. I had leaned against it, brushed it with my shoulder, hung pictures on either side of it. I had never seen it. I had never allowed myself to see it, because to see it would be to acknowledge that I had spent 43 years facing the wrong way. I approached it slowly, my hand extended. The brass was cool and smooth beneath my fingers. The handle turned with a soft, well-oiled click. I pulled. Beyond the threshold was not another room. It was not the hallway or the street or any of the other spaces I had traversed in my long, circular journey. It was the place I had been walking toward my entire life, the destination I had sought in every door I had ever opened and closed behind me. It was home. Not the apartment, not the building, not the city. Home, in its most essential, irreducible form. The place where I had always been, the place I had never been able to leave, the place I had spent 43 years trying to find by looking everywhere else. I stood in the doorway, one foot on either side of the threshold. She watched me, her face calm, her hands again folded in her lap. She had not moved from where she stood. She had only stepped aside, revealing what had always been behind me. I did not ask why she had waited so long to show me. I did not ask how she knew. I simply stepped through. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. The handle turned, the lock engaged, the threshold sealed. I was home. I had always been home. And she, the silent cartographer, had finally corrected my persistent, lifelong error. She stepped aside, revealing a door that had always been behind me. And I, who had spent my whole life facing forward, finally understood that the way forward was the way back, into the room I had never truly left. The bus station smelled of diesel and departure, a scent I had associated my entire life with the possibility of elsewhere. I stood at the edge of the platform, a single bag at my feet, a one-way ticket in my hand. The destination was arbitrary, a town I had never visited, a name I had selected from a map with my eyes closed. It didn't matter where I was going. What mattered was that I was leaving. I had tried to leave before. Dozens of times. I had packed bags, bought tickets, stood at this very platform with the same intention burning in my chest. And each time, something had stopped me. A delayed train. A forgotten document. A sudden, inexplicable fatigue that drained the resolve from my limbs. The city had held me, not with walls or locks, but with an invisible gravity I could never quite overcome. It was not that I was trapped. It was that I was not yet ready to be released. This morning was different. I woke before dawn, not with the frantic urgency of escape, but with a calm, settled clarity. I packed my bag slowly, deliberately, choosing each item with the care of a curator preparing an exhibit. I made coffee. I sat in my chair and watched the gray light fill the room. I did not say goodbye. There was no one to say goodbye to. I simply stood, picked up my bag, and walked out the door. The streets were quiet, the morning still holding its breath. I walked without haste, my footsteps finding the familiar rhythm of pavement and curb. The buildings on either side did not loom, they stood in patient attendance, their windows dark, their facades composed. The streetlights, which had flickered to life at my approach for as long as I could remember, remained dark. I did not need them. I knew this route. I had walked it 1,000 times, always toward the station, always with the intention of departure, always turning back before I reached the platform. Today, I did not turn. The station appeared at the end of the street, its modest facade unchanged by decades of arrivals and departures. I bought my ticket from the same machine I had always used, fed it the same crumpled bills, received the same thin slip of paper. The destination was different. The intention was the same. But something fundamental had shifted, not in the city, but in me. I stood at the platform, my ticket in hand, and waited for the bus that would carry me away from this place I had spent my entire life trying to leave. The engine approached, a low, patient rumble. The doors sighed open. I picked up my bag and stepped forward. And the city let me leave. Not with a dramatic release. Not with a final, sighing exhalation. Simply with a cessation of resistance. The invisible gravity that had held me for so long simply relaxed. The air became ordinary air. The pavement became ordinary pavement. The buildings, which had watched my every departure with silent judgment, turned their attention elsewhere. I was no longer the subject of their patient observation. I was just a man, boarding a bus, leaving a city that had finally fully, accepted my departure. I found a seat by the window. The bus pulled away from the platform, its diesel hum steady and indifferent. I watched the station recede, then the familiar streets, then the neighborhood I had traversed for decades. The city unfolded beneath me, not as a labyrinth of endless circuits, but as a finite, comprehensible geography. I saw its boundaries for the first time: the river to the east, the park to the west, the highway curving south toward the distant hills. It was not infinite. It was not eternal. It was a place, like any other place, with edges and limits and a shape that could be held in the mind. The bus accelerated. The city receded. The familiar skyline compressed into a single, sharp silhouette against the morning sky. I watched it diminish, waiting for the old panic, the desperate urge to turn back, the certainty that I was making an irreversible mistake. It did not come. The city grew smaller, then smaller still, then vanished behind a low ridge of hills. The landscape opened into fields and forests, the architecture of human habitation giving way to the older, slower rhythms of earth and sky. I had spent my entire life trying to leave. I had packed and unpacked, departed and returned, stood at this same threshold 100 times and found myself unable to cross. The city had held me, not as a prison holds an inmate, but as a hand holds a stone, waiting for the right moment to release it into the current. And now, finally, after decades of patient resistance, it had opened its palm. The bus carried me forward into a geography I did not know, toward a destination I had chosen at random, into a future that held no guarantees and no familiar landmarks. I was not afraid. I was not exhilarated. I was simply released. The city had let me leave. Not because I had finally escaped its gravity, but because I had finally fulfilled its purpose for me. I had arrived, not at a destination, but at a state of being. I had become someone who could leave without abandoning. Someone who could depart without fleeing. Someone who could board a bus and watch a city recede without feeling that he was losing a part of himself. The city let me leave. But only because I had finally arrived. And as the bus carried me deeper into the unknown geography of my own life, I understood that I was not leaving home. I was carrying it with me, folded into the quiet certainty that had settled in my chest, a map I no longer needed to consult because I had finally learned to read its contours from within.
Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.